We are live, MythVision podcast. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you're having a wonderful day. It is snowing, or at least it snowed a lot up here in Washington. I have a special guest, as usual, an expert in the field of New Testament studies, and of course, I would say late Second Temple Judaism as well. Professor James D. Tabor, welcome back.
Great to be with you. And I would even expand that and say ancient Mediterranean religions. So
yeah,
the Greco-Roman world. I work with Jonathan Smith, so
exactly. Yeah,
not exactly a narrow focus guy. So,
yeah, for sure. Anyone who knows Dr. Smith knows that he is what young kids today would say the OG of biblical studies, and I'm privileged to have you here today. I hear we've got some discussion about the teacher of righteousness. We're going to get into 5 things we could pretty much rest our hat on or go to the bank on, probably pertaining to the historical Dead Sea Scroll teacher of righteousness that was part of the Qumran community. We're going to dive into that. But first, let's get our shameless plugs out of the way and mention you have a website where people could sign up and get part of your email list for free. You don't give out people's emails, but they get notified about a lot of stuff that's coming up. Looks like you got a tour on the Apostle Paul coming up. You're going to the Mediterranean?
It's a cruise. Yeah, I've never done this before.
Ooh.
So we're going to do, Italy and Greece and Turkey and all the islands. And I'm going to talk about the seafaring Paul. And it's got 6 lectures and I think there are 9 different stops. People can click on the link and read about it.
Yeah.
And it gives me time to hang out with people like you, because I'm going to try to get you to go. So,
I actually might jump
on. You and Ryan need to go. You've done the Holy Land. You need to do the Mediterranean cruise. Plus a cruise. Sure. Are you kidding?
Yeah, we have never been on a cruise, and I'm moving in August, so I'll be in Florida, and hopefully we'll be situated. If we are, let's do it. Let's go. I'd look forward to that and seeing some of the ancient sites that are at least said to where Paul has gone, and then look at the Greek and Roman world in a way that
Pompeii, for example, you've got to go to Pompeii, Derek. You're walking the streets of a Greco-Roman village. I'll take you in the brothel.
So I can read
everything. I've been to Pompeii a lot, and I've been to Corinth. I've been to Athens. So, and the other thing about a cruise or a tour, because I have that Israel tour that you've been on, is to hang out with people that are our friends, our followers, our fans, even maybe, and to have that leisure time. Remember on our tour how we could just sit and talk at night around the campfire.
Yeah.
And of course, we won't have a campfire on the cruise, but we'll have plenty of luxury.
Yeah.
And that's part of it, is just hanging out with people, on a one-to-one basis. So
yeah, I look forward to that. I'll have to talk with Ryan, and you and me will talk offline and see what our schedule looks like. But I would really like to do something like that if we can make it happen. And I want to make it, so everybody else, you can go and sign up as well if you're interested in going on a cruise.
This is really just to advertise the blog, jamestabor.com. That just happened to be there. I wasn't even planning on mentioning the cruise, but there it is, because I just put that up yesterday.
Well, that's what I saw. I was like, hold on, seafaring, what? Because you're always doing something. You do not stop. You haven't skipped a beat. You'll be in the grave moving around. Okay. That's how much Dr. Tabor moves around. We did a course, Jesus and the Dead Sea Scrolls. This one right here, you compare Jesus to the Qumran community, at least seeing similarities and differences and diving deep into the scrolls, learning things. And today's topic is going to cover this, but not only can people sign up for the course, you're doing Zoom lectures with students. You've been doing them for a long time. You got another one coming up. When is that one?
The last Sunday of the month. I think it's the 28th. Let's see. Yeah.
Of this month?
Yeah, 28th of January. And what I do, you study this course at your own pace. You can see the lectures over there. It's got a huge course pack, all kinds of supplementary readings. It's self-taught.
Mm-hmm.
But if people sign up between now and the 28th, the link to that Zoom meeting will be there. You don't have to have finished the course.
Right.
And we're going to discuss in detail really centering on the teacher. It's part of what we're going to do today. So I'm giving you just a teeny little glimpse today into some of the material that we'll cover. And I think next Friday, we're going to do another segment of this and talk about sometimes people say, well, did the teacher suffer and die? And did they believe he was rose and ascended to heaven? Is that Christianizing him too much? And we'll talk about all that. But so that'll be, but today we're going to do his career.
Okay.
You know, what do you know? You know how we say, when I study historical Jesus stuff, I always say to the students, first day of class, what do we know about Jesus and how do we know it? Right. Now, not an easy question to answer, with many, many scholars weighing in and having different conclusions. But the key is to get your method down, I think, to all agree on what are some of the sources and the texts that could be used. So I just want to do that with this enigmatic figure, the teacher of righteousness. Michael Wise calls him the first Messiah, this wonderful book by Michael Wise, The Messiah Before Jesus. Because when you see that title, the first Messiah, and I'm using Messiah here, not just to mean a Davidic figure, but an anointed one. He could be anointed of the Spirit. He could be priestly. He could be Davidic, but he's the guy. Right. And as you're going to see, just as Christians made Jesus the guy, prophet, priest, king, everything, the Qumran community began to look to this extraordinary person as the final word from heaven, the final revelator of everything, the final interpreter of everything. And they thought they were in the end of days. So it gives us a chance to study a figure who's apocalyptic, messianic, talking about a new covenant, talking about preparing the way in the wilderness, some very similar things to the Jesus movement. But the Jesus movement is 100 years later, you see. Right. So it's not a matter of, who came first. The teacher clearly came first. But I think it's just fascinating, and we're going to talk about it. You asked me, Tabor, could you do maybe the 5 big points we know about this guy? Right. And, even before I start that, I want to say, I don't know his name.
Right.
At least with the Nazarene, we got a name, Yeshua, right, or Yehoshua, or Jesus in English, from the Greek Jesus. But with this guy, we don't even know his name, which makes it all the more intriguing trying to place him. But we're going to see what we can get out of the texts themselves. So I'm going to give you an overview, not too many details, just right, the sketch. I've got some notes here with just key phrases. We don't want to get too much in the weeds. Now, in the course, we get in the weeds, not in a way that'll leave you behind, but it's just going to pull you in. And the reason we do these Zoom meetings every month is to allow you to ask questions, to have interchange, and the students actually get to know each other. This is not a webinar. Webinars are fine, but that would just be me on a screen talking, and hundreds of you watching me talk, and then you put your questions in the chat, and I might answer 4 or 5 of them. Bye. Now, this is a group. This is a class. There's 50 people on each screen. So if we have 50 or more, you have another screen. But whenever anybody talks, they pop up. So people actually begin to refer to each other personally. Well, as John said this, I was wondering that, and kind of bounce off each other. It really does. You've been in these. It has a classroom dynamic. It really does. And I want that. I want that to be that way.
So. Well, just to comment on the teacher of righteousness that I find ironic, you point out they don't mention his name, but when we say 5 things that we can know about him, are you suggesting that because there's going to be scholars who go, we can't know anything about the guy?
Yeah.
There's, we're critical scholars. We want to be critical. We don't want to jump to conclusions, but based on the writings we found in the Dead Sea Scrolls that discuss the teacher of righteousness, you're saying we can actually look at them and find some pretty evident things about this character that you would say points to this is a fact about this guy, or at least is how it's observed about this person by its followers.
Certainly, the things that the group attributes to him, we could say with some certainty because we're going to read the text.
Right.
Now, did they embellish? Did they exaggerate? I think they're expressing their beliefs. So to deconstruct that into what he was is just as difficult as going back to Jesus. There has to be a method. But it's not like the Gospels where I have a narrative and then I think, well, what was embellished in that narrative? I'm creating the narrative by putting together everything that is said about him in the scrolls. And I've grouped these together. And there could be more than 5. You and I just decided on 5, I think, as a way of limiting it a little bit. But in the Zoom meeting, I'll encourage people, come up with some more. Maybe we got
based on the evidence that we're looking
evidence. Now, this is about him, not the content of his teaching.
Right.
We cover that as well. But the figure, like what are they saying about him? And it's really extraordinary. And in the back of your head, as I'm covering these, you're going to think, oh, Jesus, early Christianity, Jesus, early Christianity.
You can't help it. He is the black hole that gets you sucked in. Yeah,
exactly. But one thing I can say is, you know, nobody thinks these texts are written in the time of Jesus. So we are talking about a messianic figure, let's call him, a redemptive figure, not just any, but the ultimate one. The same thing that Christians say about Jesus, Muslims say about Muhammad, and Jews say about Moses. This is their guy. Was he a cult leader? Was he a movement leader? We could call it the Dead Sea Scroll movement or the Qumran movement. They call themselves the New Covenanters. I kind of like that. But then you go like, oh, wait a minute. Didn't the early Christians also begin to think they were part of a new covenant? So it gets really interesting. That's
Are you sure they weren't called the People's Front of Judea? Or
yeah, right. The Palestine Liberation Front. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Hey, that was such a funny, good part of the movie. I loved the humor. I can't wait to dive in. We did get super chats, so I defer to you on how. Do we want to go through the 5 and then take?
I would rather go through the 5, yeah. And,
okay,
because I might use parts of this, and that way I can use it myself as well.
Yeah, I totally agree, and I hope so.
But
let's go through the 5, and
yeah, let's go through. And this is a survey. This is to whet your appetite and to encourage you to sign up for the course.
Exactly.
And then we can begin to have a relationship. And you know, people in the course can email me and get answers. I mean, you become my students, so it takes a lot of time, but I love working with the group that we have.
That's awesome.
Okay, you want to do the countdown?
Yeah, let's do it.
So number 1, we want to talk about when was the teacher. You know, what can we know about when he was? And in one of the documents, it's called the Damascus document, and I'm not going to explain all the background of that. There's a whole lecture on it. We do get a kind of a funny chronology. I say funny because working out the years are not the same as our years today. So I'll read you the phrase. It's in column 1, the opening of the Damascus document. It says, in the age of wrath, 390 years after he'd given them into the hand of King Nebuchadnezzar. So our date would be, 586. Write that down, right? You know, Nebuchadnezzar conquered Jerusalem. He visited them and caused a plant root to spring from Israel and Aaron. This is the group and its origin. They call it a plant root, like a root at a dry ground coming up. That's not the teacher, though. Then they say, we recognize we were guilty men, and for 20 years we wandered like blind men groping for the way. Notice the word way, the way. Remember the book of Acts? They actually call the movement the way. Anybody members of the way? Here it is. 100 years earlier, people are saying, groping for the way. Now listen to this. And God observed their deeds, this little group that's trying to follow the pure way of God. And they sought him with the whole heart. And he raised up for them a teacher of righteousness to guide them in the way of his heart. Okay, so we have 390 years, and then for 20 years, they're just like, how do we follow God? What can we do? We want to seek God, want to follow the Torah and the prophets. And this teacher comes. So if you add all that up, 390 plus the 20, you're going to come to 176 BC. That's what everybody thought for years. And that was the traditional view, that it's like just before the time of Antiochus Epiphanes, the Maccabean period, 165. Now, many of us, including Michael Wise, who's done the definitive work on this, that's in the Oxford Handbook of the Dead Sea Scrolls, his article, it's just become pretty persuasive. By looking at the names of people mentioned, we now think we would date him to the 1st century BCE, not the 2nd.
Right.
And you say, well, wait a minute, 390 plus 20, 586, how you're playing with the dates. We know from antiquity, they're not dating the Persian period like we are. So once you make the adjustments, it comes out to, some of your listeners will know, Alexander Jannaeus, very famous Hashmonean ruler. He dies in 76. And around that time and shortly after, we think we can date the teacher. So I don't know if we can absolutely nail it down, but when people say, well, I put Jesus around the year 30.
Right.
I'm saying that. I'm saying I'm putting the teacher around the year 70, let's say 70 BCE. And one of the ways we date it,
mention a Jesus who dies around the time of Alexander Jannaeus. I'm just.
No, I think it's actually a different date.
Is it? I thought it was around Alexander Jannaeus. There's a guy named Joshua. I think that, but
the Talmudic guy.
Yeah.
I thought it was a different date, but anyway.
Okay.
So that's where we generally are. And the way this is done, just so you know the method real quickly, what Wise does is he just tallies up all the historical figures that are mentioned anywhere in any of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and they start playing out around the time of the Romans coming in and shortly thereafter. For example, no Herod the Great. Now, if they're living through the reign of Herod the Great, they're living through the reign of all the Roman emperors, and so forth, Tiberius and Augustus, the early ones, wouldn't there be something about the major events? And so you see the method is just to take the latest date mentioned. And that seems to put us in the 1st century BCE. The second point that I think we can say, they expect this guy, this teacher, whom they call the one who's going to guide them in the way of his heart, to be a prophet like Moses. Now, what does that mean? There's this odd scripture in Deuteronomy. I'm not going to actually read it right now. Let me just read you from the scrolls what they say. They talk about that none shall depart from the counsels of the law and walk in the stubbornness of their hearts, but shall be ruled by the precepts which the men of the community were first instructed, until there shall come the prophet and the messiahs of Aaron and Israel. Now notice that, 3 figures, the prophet and the messiahs of Aaron and Israel. Maybe 2 messiahs.
Right.
That word, the prophet, you might remember from the Gospel of John. John has asked the baptizer, who are you? And you get a reflection of the kind of candidates that they're working with in that time. And they go, are you the prophet? You see how they would know this term, the prophet. And then he says, no. Are you the Messiah? He goes, no. Are you Elijah? No, that'd be the priestly Messiah. Well, who are you? And he says, I'm the voice crying in the wilderness. So very interesting. Voice crying in the wilderness, this group in their community rule, that's where that quote comes from. This is the period before the teacher, when they're blindly groping in the way, and they set down their community rule, you see. And what it says is, just do the stuff that we figured out until the prophet comes, and then the messiahs of Aaron and Israel will come. So they got their 3 figures, just like the Gospel of John. So who's this prophet like Moses? Well, in other Dead Sea Scrolls, they quote Deuteronomy. It's Deuteronomy 18, verse 18. And in that text, Moses is recorded as saying, after I die, God will raise up a prophet like me, and I'll put my words in his mouth, and you've got to obey that prophet.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that could refer historically to just any successor of Moses, any prophet. Some people say Joshua. But in the Torah, Joshua's got to go to the priest if he has a yes or no question. He doesn't sound much like the prophet like Moses. Remember, he goes to Eleazar. Eleazar says, let me check the Urim here. It's kind of some kind of dice thing that they did, yes, no. It's sort of
right.
This kind of idea. And in the New Testament, we have in Acts 3 and in Acts 7, Peter and then Stephen saying, oh, Jesus, he's the prophet like Moses. They actually say that. So early Christians are making Jesus this main guy. And what do we find in the Dead Sea Scrolls? Until there come the prophet and the Messiahs of Aaron in Israel. So they see him as the prophet like Moses. We don't need to throw up a map, but have people take a look at a map of the Judean desert where Qumran is. And if you stand Qumran and look across the Dead Sea, Derek, as you and I did when we were there, you see Nebo and Pisgah right where Moses died or disappeared, according to the last chapter of Deuteronomy. Mm-hmm. So they're waiting for another Moses to come. And they position themselves right there. I don't know for sure that's why the settlement's there. It's an Iron Age settlement that they take over. But, it is a pretty well front row seat for a prophet like Moses to come. And there are lots of other texts that you could apply. So what's the big deal about the prophet like Moses? Well, he's a new Moses. Mm-hmm. He's going to be the be all and end all of a prophetic figure. You see, Jews look to Moses, Christians look to Jesus, Muslims look to Muhammad. What they're saying is another final prophet will come, and he's the prophet like Moses. And so when that is written in the community rule, he hasn't come yet. So they're just saying, hold on, God will send this guy. Right. Well, what you most expect often happens. Now, they also talk about in the Damascus document, and this is after he's come, they talk about the interpreter of the Torah, and then they talk about when he comes, who shall teach righteousness at the end of days. So it's getting more specific. This is the final guy that'll be like a new Moses figure. Does that sound familiar from the book of Hebrews, maybe? You see where I'm going here? Yes. Meaning these kinds of ideas are already circulating among apocalyptic groups in the Roman period, 100 years before Jesus. And then they say the star is the interpreter of the law. You remember that text in Numbers? A star will come and a scepter. A star is light and a scepter is rule. You know what they say? The star is the teacher who's going to come, and the scepter is the Davidic Messiah, the prince of the congregation. So these are ways that they interpret, these are ways that they explain who this teacher is. Now, every rabbi interprets the law. I suppose all the prophets, in a way, interpret the law. But when you say the star is the interpreter of the law, he who comes who will teach righteousness at the end of days, you're saying it's the final guy. Right. He's not just going to, my opinion is this, like in the Talmud or the Mishnah. My opinion is this, and Rabbi Yehoshua says this, and Rabbi so and so forth says this. That's not it. Now, this is the guy that says, my decision is, and he's like Moses. Remember, they would bring things to Moses in the Torah, and he would say, okay, this and this and this. And so that's what they're expecting. They're expecting a new Moses. That's what they think is going to come. Now, what do they call him? Here, he's just called the interpreter of the Torah. We say teacher of righteousness in English, but actually, John Reeves has argued, and he's a colleague at mine at UNC Charlotte. I've retired now, but great Dead Sea Scroll scholar. He's argued that it actually means the right teacher. Another teacher of righteousness, you put the genitive in, but it's morei tzedek, the true teacher. I love that. You know, that's beginning to sound very cultish. There's a lot of teachers, but are you following the true teacher, the prophet like Moses, the final guy that's coming at the end of days? See what's happening here. Again, how many times am I going to say this? 100 years before the time of Jesus.
Right.
Okay. Number 3, this guy has the correct interpretation of the Sabbath, the festivals, clean and unclean. And again, I'm reading the Damascus document where his role is described. They will keep the Sabbath according to its exact interpretation. Remember in the New Testament, everybody's like, how do you keep the Sabbath? Jesus is criticized and dialogues with the Pharisees and the Sadducees back and forth. You know, what does it mean to rest and so forth? Big question in Judaism. The beginning tractate of the Talmud is Shabbat, meaning, I'm sorry, that's not actually correct. One of the beginning is Barakot, but the blessings of the Sabbath. And then there's a tractate of the Mishnah called Shabbat. So correct myself there. Now notice this though, the exact interpretation and the feast and the day of fasting according to the findings of members of the new covenant. So once this teacher comes, he's got a calendar that he is approving. And we know of this calendar. We call it the Jubilees calendar. And I'm not going to get into the weeds here, but you see that little chart. We'll put this chart into the course pack. This is new, some added material you can get. But I can explain it very clearly in terms of what they're doing. We have, just think, Derek, we have a 365 and a quarter solar year, right?
Right.
They don't like that. That's like some months are 30, some are 31, then you got to add a leap year. That's clumsy. God would not create the heavens and the earth in such disharmony. The original year is 360 days. That's in the book of Jubilees, remember? The book of Jubilees. Every month is 30. Okay, 12 times 30 is 360. And you say, yeah, but a solar year has got those 5 extra days. What are you going to do? Well, you see, if you look at this chart, you've zoomed in on it where people can see. This is like creating perfection in a disordered universe. It's unbelievable. The teacher taught this, and he might have picked it up from texts like the Book of Jubilee, but they have it in great detail. It looks kind of complicated, but once you learn it, it's real simple. If you look across, you see that you got your months divided into 3 sections. Month 1, 4, 7, and 10, 2, 5, 8, 11, 3, 6, 9, and 12. There's your 12 months, 360 days. Now, in the first group, 30-day months. Second group, 30-day months. But in those last 4, and notice they're alternating them, you add 1 day. It doesn't change the day of the week. You just add 31. Now you're up to 364, you see? Now, we don't know what they did with the quarter day. It could be that they don't even know about it. That means the year will get slightly off over time. But a quarter day a year, you know, if it's a movement that lasts, 50, 100 years, they'll start thinking the seasons are out of kilter, right? It's just like, hey, spring last year was, around the time of the harvest, and now it seems like it's a little bit later. But the rabbinic calendar that's used today by Jews is a lunar calendar, and it's 11 days off. Think of it. Did you know the Muslims follow they follow the lunar calendar without intercalating those extra 11 days.
Right.
So if you've ever followed Ramadan, you go, Ramadan's in July. And then a few years later, Ramadan's in January. It's moving 11 days a year.
Yeah.
So what the Jews do is they intercalate 7 out of 19 years. They put in an extra month. It's almost like jerking something back. Like we're getting off, pull it back. We're getting off, pull it back. Now, the teacher doesn't want this. He wants harmony, perfect harmony. Now, notice this. You see that Wednesday, day 1 under month 1?
Yes.
That's because Genesis 1 says God created light on the 3rd day. You see that? No, I'm sorry. I'm getting mixed up here. That's because Genesis 1 says that God created the planets and the sun and moon and stars and the seasons on the third day.
Got it.
So you don't need to know. All you need to know is, are you in month 1? And the Wednesday of that month will be the first day of the month. It's nothing to do with the moon. You just count. And then all the festivals, I've got them marked in red there. They come on certain days of the week. So it gave them this feeling of harmony. Now, here's a really interesting story. That would mean that Yom Kippur, you see how it's marked there in month 7? You have their festivals. I'm leaning in to look. See where that 10 is red under? Okay, that's Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. There you go. It's always on a Friday. So you just start counting down 1 through 7, 8 through 14, 15 through 21. Don't you like the harmony of that? See?
Right.
And so if you were born, let's say you were born on the 17th day of the first month. You see that? Pick 17, just arbitrarily. Then your birthday is always the same day of the week and the same day of the month. Isn't that nice?
Right.
Instead of me saying, well, I was born March 2nd, but the year I was born, it was a Saturday. And this year they don't like that. So they believe that this is God's ordained order and the cosmos is all coming apart and the calendar is real important. Now listen to this. The teacher has an enemy. We don't know who he is by name, but he's called the wicked priest. And in a commentary on the book of Habakkuk, which is very important to us for the teacher, they talk about the wicked priest pursuing the teacher of righteousness to his house of exile on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. Now, you see what's happening here? His Yom Kippur would be a regular day to the Jews in Jerusalem because they're keeping a different calendar. But he's got his Jubilees calendar. And he appeared before them. Now, he wouldn't be able to travel down on Yom Kippur. The wicked priest, he might even be the high priest of Israel. He'd be in the temple doing his thing on the holiest day of the Jewish year. But if the group is following this calendar that we just talked about, the teacher's Yom Kippur is a holy day that he doesn't recognize. And it says he appeared before them to confuse them and cause them to stumble on the day of fasting. Can you imagine? You're fasting on Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the year, and the high priest from Jerusalem shows up and says, I want to talk to the teacher. And it says he wanted to abuse them and cause them to stumble. So, you know the book of Jubilees, Derek, and it actually is a book that has survived that talks about a lot of these things. Now, to us today, you go, well, who cares about the calendar and the days of the week and all that and Sabbath? Well, this group does. They feel that they are restoring the original harmony of creation, and it feels good to them. You know, we're keeping the true feasts. So when God's presence comes on the wrong day up in Jerusalem, God's not even working with them, but we have the original true festival. So that was number 3. Number 4, this is a big one. Save this for last. It's from the Habakkuk Pesher again. God told Habakkuk to write down what would happen to the final generation. Wow. So you open the book of Habakkuk, it's in the Hebrew Bible. And in the book of Habakkuk, chapter 2, he did not make known to him when time would come to an end. But he did say what would happen. And he says, what does that mean? This means the teacher of righteousness to whom God made known all the mysteries of the words of his servants, the prophets. So what they believe is this guy, once he's come, not only has he straightened out the calendar, given all the proper interpretations of the Torah, he's like a new Moses. He's bringing a new covenant, but also he has the mysteries of all the prophets. So, you know, turn to Isaiah 11, he'll tell you what it means. Turn to Isaiah 65, turn to any of the prophecies of the Bible. This guy can tell you what it means. He is directly inspired. We have other texts that say he put the words of God, that God put his own words in this prophet's mouth. So this is a highly exalted figure. In terms of late Second Temple Judaism, he would be the most exalted figure of any kind of Jewish movement that we know of. I mean, no other leader claims this sort of revelation. Then it goes on to say that the final age will be prolonged. And I'll tell you about this in a minute. It has to do, his death was supposed to mark the final 40 years, and it didn't. That's number 5. We'll get to it. So when the end didn't come, does this sound familiar? This generation will not pass till all these things are fulfilled. And then it passed and all those things weren't fulfilled. Mark 13. Guess what? They quote, the righteous will live by faith. Faith in what? Faith that the teacher was really true, that his death did mark the end. Now listen to this. Whom God will deliver if you have faith in the teacher, because this was written after the 40 years has passed. It says, God has prolonged the days. The mysteries of his will are astounding. If it tarries, wait for it, it'll surely come. Don't give up on the teacher. He is the true guy, okay? Notice, whom God will deliver from the house of judgment because of their suffering, the followers, their suffering, and because of their faith in the teacher of righteousness.
Ooh.
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah. And these people, James, that we're doing a live stream next week, we're going to get into, maybe you should actually tease them. I don't want to give away but this is.
What is the suffering?
Right.
If any man would come after me, let him tease
up his cross and follow.
I didn't say that. We'll talk about how he died next time. Okay, so he has the revelations of all the mysteries, and his death is the final clock ticking of the countdown. Now, let me try to explain how they calculated. It's really cool to figure out. We can actually figure it out. I'll read you a couple of texts. From the day of the gathering of the teacher until the coming of the Messiah will be about 40 years. See, they actually say that. From the day of the gathering of the teacher till the end of all the men of war who deserted to the liar. The liar is the guy that fought. He's not the wicked priest. The teacher has 2 enemies. He's got a liar who's within the group that rises up and
kind of a Judas in a way.
A Judas, and opposes him and maybe leads a rival movement for some reason. So from the gathering of the teacher to the end of all the men of war who deserted the liar will pass about 40 years. And then in one of the commentaries on Psalms, a little while the wicked will be no more. Well, how long's a little while? Remember? Until the end of all the, I'm sorry, I will look towards his place, but he shall not be there. What does that mean? Interpreted, this means all the wicked. At the end of 40 years, they will be blotted out, and no evil man will be found on the earth. Whoa, isn't that amazing? So not only is he interpreting and bringing the new calendar, he is the kingpin of the time of the end. His death marks the final 40 years. Now, how did they come up with this? Do you remember that 390 years?
Yeah.
Add this up in your head. You can do this easily. Anybody can. 390, and then you add 20 where they're wandering and groping before he comes, right? So now we're at 410. And then we got a 40-year period that's going to lead to the end. And if you figure, well, how long did he then teach or rule or whatever, you got about 40 years left. And you come to 490 years. You get it?
Yeah.
There's add 390 plus 20 plus 40 years after his death. Then the middle period would be about 40 years. Now, I can't prove that this is exactly a date in time, but that's how they're doing it. Now, why would they do that kind of thing? Because they're trying to fit it into Daniel 9, the 70 weeks prophecy. If you studied the Bible and prophecy, and I give you the number 490, you're going to go, oh, that's Daniel 9, who predicts the coming of the Messiah, the cutting off, and the destruction of Jerusalem and so forth, and destruction of the world, of all the evil ones. Well, they call that 10 Jubilees. Why? Because a Jubilee is 49 years. 49 times 10 is 490. And it says in the scrolls that in the first week of the Jubilee that follows the 9, that would be the first week of the final 49-year period, then the atonement of all the sons of light will come. So they've actually got a date, but then the date doesn't come. So then we get a case of prophecy failing. If it tarries, wait for it, it will surely come. And that's where we kind of trail off with the teacher. So those are the kind of things we can say. We study them in detail in the course. I give lectures on each one of these points in the course. So basically, those are the 5 points, and I think we can begin to put together. Now, one other thing we have that I'm not touching on, and it'll be next Friday when we talk. And we're really getting into it in our Zoom meetings. We've already had 3 or 4 Zoom meetings. And that is, we might have 12 Psalms, 11, maybe 12, that the teacher of righteousness himself wrote, and they're autobiographical. Now, we don't have that with Jesus.
Right.
And that, if they are from his hand, which many scholars call them the teacher hymns, and they differ as to how many. But you have a first-person guy saying things that wouldn't be true of the group. For example, if you're reading the Psalms of David, a lot of them you can just read. The Lord is my shepherd. Well, that's David, but you're a pious follower of the God of Israel. The Lord is my shepherd. I can read that. But there are other things where David might say things that have nothing to do with you. It's too specific, you see. Well, that's how these teacher hymns are. So the part I haven't given you yet, it's like the other shoe dropping. If these teacher hymns are really from the teacher, we would have first-person writing of the teacher passed down to us. You could still question how reliable it is.
Right.
But you would begin to get a feel for an actual personality. And, you know, when I read these and we cover them with the students, it becomes pretty convincing. And Michael Wise's book, The First Messiah, is essentially a commentary on those hymns, in which he thinks you can really reconstruct a lot. So we got the 5 points as a framework. When did he live? What did he teach? What did he claim to do? How is his death supposed to mark the end? And what happens when it doesn't come? But then we also have his inner thoughts and ideas. And that's amazing. Like he talks about an enemy sitting at table with him and lifting up his hand against him, things like that. Or other texts, strike the shepherd and the sheep will be scattered. Number of texts that are even alluded to in the New Testament as well.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the overview. I hope it interests people to study this first Messiah, if we could call him that. And again, I want to point out, I'm using Messiah to mean an anointed figure, a final figure that God would send who's going to sum it all up. A new Moses in this case.
There's so much interesting material to study about the Dead Sea Scrolls from whatever angle. I could see people who are spiritual or religious doing it for devotional reasons, and somehow this edifies them in their life. And then there are people like me who want to know history, who want to know, you know, what gave rise to the whole Jesus movement to begin with. Of course, I don't think it was abracadabra. I don't think it just popped up. I think that there's a long trend of ideas among Jewish communities that are in the Hellenistic period that are coming up with these ideas post-Persia. And I really enjoy learning about this earlier guy who doesn't have a name, but that a lot of the material shows up in the New Testament that has a lot in common with this earlier movement from 100 years before. And really, I'd say longer than 100 years, because by the time the Gospels are written, we're stretching it to the latter half.
He's also called, by the way, I didn't mention this because teacher of righteousness is what we even used in the title of the show, but he's also called the beloved teacher, and get this, the unique teacher, meaning, you know, the special one, the only teacher.
Right.
So he has these other names that might also remind you of some things that come later with the Jesus movement. Okay.
Are you the modern day teacher? No, I'm just kidding. No, I
No,
really
I'm the
enjoyed
modern
working.
day teacher of the teacher,
So,
meaning I'm teaching about the teacher.
just in case
But I'm
anybody's
not
showing up,
unique, and I don't know if I'm beloved or not.
just to make sure everybody knows, you're just now tuning in. We covered 5 things we could probably know pretty well about the teacher of righteousness from the Dead Sea Scrolls that we know about that was in Qumran. We placed him around the 1st century BCE, probably around 70 BCE. And you covered these 5 details. You're going to go deeper into your next Zoom meeting for those who sign up for the Dead Sea Scroll and Jesus course. And you're what I love about you, James, is you really do follow up with your students, and you're having these hangouts. So I encourage everybody, if you haven't signed up, go sign up for the course, Jesus and the Dead Sea Scrolls. And then we have some super chats when you're ready. So is there anything you want to cover first?
Yeah, the only thing I want to cover is just to say that next Friday, I'm going to tantalize you without revealing as much, because I want you to come to the Zoom meeting and be in the course, because then you become part of what was called the Yakad, the community. They call themselves the Yakad. I'm not going to make you a new covenanter or anything else. I won't baptize you or take your money, because they shared their goods in common. But you'll be a part of this group that's studying this material together.
Right.
And I would just want to say that what I want to raise is, do we have enough evidence to talk carefully, not simplistically, about this extraordinary figure, the prophet like Moses, with all the revelation of all the mysteries, whose death marks the countdown to the end? Do we know enough about him to be able to say that he died by being killed, or basically, was he killed, or did he just die an old natural death in bed as he got older? Was it a violent death? Do we know anything about that? Are there any allusions to that in the scrolls? And if he died, was it expected or was it a disappointment? And whether it was expected or a disappointment, how did the community deal with the missing teacher, especially after 40 years? Once the clock quits ticking, then what's going to happen? And we do have within the Thanksgiving hymns some material that might indicate that they thought he was raised up to the heavens and given a throne among the gods. Now, if that's the case, and I'm not going to reveal it, I'm going to kind of tantalize you next week. We're going to do a thing next Friday. And I mainly just want to talk about suffering servant ideas. Mm-hmm. But in the Zoom meeting, we'll actually look at the text. The students already in the course have downloaded a document that your wife uploaded to the course, and it has these passages marked and so forth in the Thanksgiving hymns that we're going to discuss in the Zoom meeting. So
thank you. Yeah. Okay, we're going to move over here to give you guys shout outs for the support and topic discussed. Thank you, Gary, for being a member for 20 months. Almost 2 years of the YouTube channel. You're one of the first, I think, that ever joined. Thank you so much for being a member. Stop Scamming Man. Hi, Derek. I'm really glad you introduced us to James Tabor. His YouTube channel, James Tabor, has been way past next level, especially in the last few weeks. So you've been working hard with your YouTube channel, James?
Yeah, what I'm doing, I started series. So I did, what does the Bible say about death? Actually, not what the Bible says. Ancient views of death, afterlife, and the future. And then after that, I basically began to talk about prophecy, Bible prophecy, interpretations of Bible prophecy through the ages. That was 25 parts. And I think Stop Scamming Man is talking about the new series, which is Jesus Archaeology, in scare quotes, meaning if you want to study Jesus of Nazareth, is there anything archaeologically in the evidence that we've dug up in the Holy Land that might shed light on anything about Jesus or his movement? And there's some surprising things that we've come up with. I've excavated at some of the places that I talk about, like Sepphoris is a big example. what is Sepphoris? And
I loved that place. We didn't get enough time there. I'm not gonna lie. I really wish
people haven't even heard of it. Sepphoris is the urban capital of the Galilee. Nazareth is a little teeny village of probably 200 people just south of Sepphoris. And I already did one in Nazareth too, in the archaeological evidence there. But if Jesus is a tecton, or a stone worker, I would call it, more than a carpenter. He's a builder, and he's working either as a day laborer, or maybe he has a little building business from his father to, build foundations and so forth. Then Sepphoris is right north, and guess what? The Romans destroyed it in 4 BC because of the revolt of Judas, not Judas the Galilean, that's later. This is Judas, son of Hezekiah. He's a guy that Herod the Great conquered, Hezekiah. Now his son has popped up and started a little revolt when Herod dies. You can imagine there's a vacuum. And it's centered in Sepphoris. So the Romans send legions down under Varus and just burn the place to the ground. So in our excavations, we find the evidence of the destruction, but also it's being rebuilt, and Josephus, the Jewish historian, calls it the jewel of all the Galilee. So I'm covering things like that. I'm not talking about, a rock with "I was Jesus" or "Jesus was here." I'm talking about what we read text, right?
Right.
For the first 10 or 15 years of my career, I could do it all in libraries, just read text. And then I began, for the past 30 years, going over, participating in excavations, excavating areas that are related to my interests in terms of Second Temple Judaism and so forth. And so that's what I'm covering now. So I think that's what he's referring to. Last few weeks.
I don't know exactly where the video is, and I'm not going to play the audio here, but you can see I got Neil on the far left.
Look, where it come? No, where are we?
Well, right there, Sepphoris, because this.
That's Sepphoris. Okay, yeah, boy, how did you find that?
This is the cool part. We actually got to see the mosaic on the ground. I've never published this. This is all stuff that you and me can still put into courses, James.
Yeah,
we're going to be doing what is it? The end of the age through the ages, or into the world through the ages course at some point. That's going to be good. But look at how this place is.
Yeah. Now those are 3rd century, 4th century mosaics, but we explain that in the lecture what they are. Yeah, the Mona Lisa of the Galilee. It's a Jewish city, but it's pretty Hellenized, as you can see by that.
All the look at the.
This is actually the synagogue here. Yeah.
Yeah, look at that. I mean, that right there. What is that?
Well, you got Helios. Yeah, you got Helios in the center too.
Helios in the center. I mean, you got like very Hellenistic motifs here. I just loved this. This was so good. I had a microphone clip to you, so we'll end up at some point, James. We're gonna
put something together. Yeah,
we can, absolutely.
Even if we just did 5 to 8 minute segments on each stop, where people just get a taste of it. Because it's not going to be like going on the tour, but kind of like we did Qumran. You did great videos at Qumran. So,
yeah, we did.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and that's in the course too. So okay,
what else you got here?
Topic discussed. Thank you for the super chat, my friend Gary. And then he sends another one and says, listening to Dr. Tabor has made me feel like I have an honorary doctorate in the Jesus movement.
Let's see. How could I begin offering those to students? Come up with a little bogus certificate. I listened to all 300 of Tabor's videos.
Absolutely. A lot of people. I mean, James, you have a way. You have a really good teaching style. And so everyone's welcome, that kind of thing. And so I think.
Well, you introduced me to the YouTube world. I thought YouTube was just where you go when you want to hear a Bob Dylan song or something, And I mean, I'd occasionally look it up to fix my toilet, but you introduced me to this wonderful group of seekers, really truth seekers out there. Not the political kind today,
right?
But people who are just fascinated with ancient religion, mythology, separating truth from fiction, theology, and so forth. And there's just hundreds of thousands of people. I mean, how many are out there?
A lot.
And particularly with a biblical interest, that Hebrew Bible, New Testament, ancient Judaism, what's it all about? And your repertoire not to flatter you, but why not? It's a who's who of just about every major scholar I can name. And I've hooked you up with quite a few of them and over the past couple of years of our association. And I mean, I don't know how anybody can navigate your channel, because you could do endless hours with Robin Faith Walsh, or with John Dominic Crossan, or Paula Friedrichsen, or Elaine Pagels. I'm running out of breath to name all the names of these. Are just major people who are the top people in the field. Dale Allison, I just love his work, and you put up some of my stuff too. So
thank you, James. Appreciate that. I'll write you a check after the show. Harmonic Atheist, thank you for the super chat. Good to see you here, my friend. I hope you're doing well. If the Essenes were Pythagoreans, is it possible that Pythagoras was the suffering servant via the suffering inflicted by Cylon of Croton, the wicked priest?
I think these kinds of patterns often exist. And when you say if something's possible, the answer is always yes, I suppose, unless it's just absolutely an absurd, contradictory statement. And we do have these kind of patterns or models. They're almost like templates. And one template is a teacher who has an outside enemy and a betrayer. Now, that would not mean that Jesus didn't have outside enemies and a betrayer, like the high priest wanted to kill him. Judas Iscariot, I would take as a historical character, betrayed him. I don't think it means that we go to the scrolls and we find the same thing. The liar turned against the community and drew people off. The wicked priest is some outsider that violates the Yom Kippur holy day of the group. So if you can find similar patterns earlier in Pythagorean materials, I don't think it means that they're getting it from the same text. When we say the suffering servant, that typically would be reserved for what are called the servant songs in the book of 2nd Isaiah. And that's where we get these 4 hymns. And what happens, songs or hymns, is they become very personal. Like, there's no question that Israel is the servant, the people of Israel. And yes, they suffer. But then you have a figure who's called the servant, who brings Israel back to God, who atones for his people and is rejected by his own people. Well, then that offers the possibility of a major figure who's not the mainstream, but is trying to bring the mainstream into his orbit or web. And that's the dynamics you get in the Jesus movement. John the Baptist and Jesus are preaching to all of Israel, but they believe that a select group will be called out that are the ones who will be the people of God when the judgment comes. And so I wouldn't throw out the idea of a pattern or template, but I would have trouble thinking any Pythagoreans are reading the book of Isaiah and modeling after that. I mean, I'm open to the idea. Right. You know, Dennis MacDonald has done a lot of stuff on these motifs that we find throughout ancient Greek literature. And I'd love to hear what he would say about that. But, you know, I don't know. I think Essenes could be called Pythagoreans because of some of their similarities.
Right.
But mainly based on the description of Josephus in the Jewish War. When you read his description, you think, boy, this sounds a lot like Pythagoreans. And then the Stoics sound like Platonists, and the Sadducees sound like Epicureans. So I think he's trying to say, hey, we got 3 philosophical schools. But I'm not so sure that his description is really of the Pythagoreans.
It's like a Hellenistic way. Like, you're saying that it's not technically genetic, but that a lot of Greeks, when they're writing about something like Herodotus talks about, where they go to this Babylonian temple and they had this really archaic, he called it a disgusting ritual, where virgin women are outside the temple in these veiled dresses, and a random stranger guy throws silver on their lap, and then they have sexual interactions, and then they go home. And it's like this weird thing that they do. But the way he described the temple of this goddess that was named, let's just say Inanna, even though it wasn't Inanna, I know it was some longer name. He goes, but we call her Athena.
Yeah.
Well, it's not that it's actually Athena, but one could argue maybe along the way that sometimes they get compared because of similarities, but it's not necessarily. Greeks often, and Hellenized people often try to correlate, like Yahweh is actually Zeus, or they found ways to connect the dots, even if they're not.
I think what he's Josephus, remember we're talking about Josephus, the Jewish historian, writing really as a patron of the Emperor Vespasian, living in his former palace in Rome around the year 74 or 5. He wants to say, hey, you guys who hate us, he writes things against pagans that criticize Judaism. He wants to say, we've got 3 upstanding philosophical schools, just like you guys. We've got Platonists, we got Stoics, and we have Pythagoreans. Now, in the course of doing that, he does describe some things we find in the scrolls, but the way he pictures them overall is more Pythagorean than it is the Dead Sea Scrolls. Like, I think they believe in resurrection of the dead, and Pythagoreans are definitely reincarnation people, as are most Greeks who have some view of afterlife. But resurrection of the dead, couldn't it kind of be seen as transmigration of the soul? Like the soul comes into maybe a new body or something, and that's how he leaves it sort of open. Whereas in Judaism, it's pretty well go out to the cemetery and make live the dead, Right. And as you're talking about tombs, a Pythagorean wouldn't need a tomb. I remember there's a famous quote from Empedocles. He said, I was once a bird, a fish, and a man, and I wept when I saw this dreadful place. He's talking about the dark earth, the evil earth, the lower earth, the lowest part of the universe.
Sounds like Plato had his hands on him.
You see the idea. And also Plato.
Yeah.
When Socrates is drinking the poison, he says, don't weep for me, weep for yourselves. I'm going home. You guys have to stay here in the dark world. I don't find that in the Dead Sea Scrolls. There's a dualism there, but it's sort of more like that moral dualism, like there's sons of darkness and children of light, I should say, and children of darkness rather than sons, because it's generic. They're people of darkness, people of light. They're all dwelling in the good earth, but the good earth is ruled by Belial, Satan. So very similar to Paul. He says Satan is the god of this world, 2 Corinthians. And he talks about Satan is behind the rulers of the world. Mm-hmm. These people believe that sort of thing. So the world gets dark, but they think it's going to get redeemed in this new creation. And they're kind of following the Hebrew Bible on that. So I talk about that a lot in my series on ideas of death and afterlife in the ancient world. It's on YouTube.
Go check it out. Victor Engelman, thank you so much for the super chat. David Oliver Smith compares the spouter of lies from the Dead Sea Scrolls to Paul. I found his arguments quite convincing. What's your take on this?
Yeah, this is Barbara Tearing argued this years ago. I don't remember if David Smith is following her or crediting her. Again, these paradigms, these models can tend to fit a number of groups. So if you have a single figure who's the good figure, and then somebody who breaks off or who takes the movement astray, you can see how that person would be called the spouter of lies. It probably depends on where you're dating these scrolls. And I think Michael Wise, as I said, offers really good evidence that this is early to mid 1st century BCE.
Right.
And therefore, it wouldn't be Paul, unless you're going to argue that all the references to the wicked priest and the spouter of lies are from the 1st century. If so, it would fit pretty well, but then you almost have to have the teacher Jesus. Barbara Tearing, by the way, argued something different from this. So I was saying, I wonder whether Smith acknowledges this. She said John the Baptist is the good teacher and Jesus is the spouter of lies. How about that for a twist? And then you've got Dr. Eisenman, who thinks of Paul certainly as the apostate, and James being the teacher of righteousness.
Right.
And Jesus doesn't really come up in that model. So you got these different models all playing with the same toolkit. Wicked opposition from the outside, betraying liar from the inside. And it does say in the scrolls, the liar sat in my council with me and ate with me at my table. So it is very much a breakaway. And it probably happens in almost every movement.
I was just about to say, like,
I've studied the Waco movement. I was involved in Branch Davidians in Waco. Not I was a Branch Davidian, and the crisis trying to work with the FBI, as some of you know, if you've seen the Waco series on Paramount, or I think it was on Netflix for a while. I even have a character in there where I'm trying to help the FBI interpret David Koresh's ideas. Well, he has a spouter of lies, Mark Bro, who left him, who sat at his table, was his most intimate confidant, turned against him and called the FBI and brought all the government in to put down the cult. So you see, that dynamic was in 1993. You don't have to go back further than that. So I think when you say, I just need to look at Smith's arguments as to whether he's dating these texts in the first century.
Right.
And then you get into paleography as well as radiocarbon dating, and that's complex, but it can be talked about. And you know me, Derek, I don't want to be open to everything, so I fall for nothing, so to speak, or fall for everything or fall for nothing, but I think for me, that model doesn't work. I always remain open, but I'm convinced that the hiatus of the movement, the florite of the movement, is right where Michael Weiss puts it, around the time of Alexander Jannaeus, Salome Alexandra, his wife, and then those two high priests, Aristobulus and Hyrcanus. So many things fit them. We also have halakhic, or interpretations of the Torah from the group, which we cover in the course. And those interpretations also don't seem to fit any aspect of the Jesus movement that we can discover. Very interested in ritual purity and touch not, taste not, handle not, and will this defy you or that defy you? It seems like the Jesus movement is breaking away from that, unless the Gospels are only reflecting Paul, which maybe Smith argues. I'm not familiar with that argument.
Right.
Thanks for the question, though.
Yeah, thank you. Stop Scamming Man. Hi, James. Your vid on ossuary archaeology left me wondering, when they are excavated and the bones from the ossuaries are buried, do they just put them in the earth, or are there preservation measures?
They're put in a common burial field that, because of all the buildings around Jerusalem, ancient graves have been uncovered by the hundreds. And the idea is to respectfully remove the remains. It would be very similar to today. If you're building in an urban area that hasn't been built in, as a city expands, you could come across an old Methodist cemetery, right? Or a slave cemetery. And what we hope people would do is respect the dead, and they would respect those graves, and the remains would be removed and reburied. It happens, I think, in most cultures. But there's a society within Israel that takes care of that burial process, group of Orthodox Jews, and they are wanting to do this with respect and reverence. And so the bones are all put together in this certain field. There are actually several places where they bury them, and they're confidential, but people can find out about them, and they simply become generic burials. Sort of like the Holocaust. It's sad but true that burials of the Nazis have been found, not individual graves, but pits where bodies were put, particularly in Poland. And some of those areas are now reverenced and marked off with a memorial. Same with the battlefield. Think of the different battlefields. You don't get all the soldiers from the Civil War at Gettysburg, right?
Right.
But you do get a memory of what happened and of the fallen. It's very similar to that.
Thank you so much. KCIN, hi. Does Dr. Tabor have any thoughts on the use of psychedelics in ancient religions to include Judaism and the Jesus movement?
Well, there we go. Mushroom cult, right? So
Allegro.
John Allegro, yeah. It's a book worth reading. I'm trying to think of textual material that would relate to that. I probably need to read his book again, whether the kinds of visions that are being experienced would in some way be comparable to different kinds of visions people have today when they take different psychedelics. There is within Judaism this Merkabah mysticism in which you ascend through the heavens and have these experiences. I wrote my dissertation on Paul's ascent to paradise, and I do talk about this. Mm-hmm. And within those magical papyri and some of the texts that we associate broadly with ascent texts, there are some hints of certain kinds of fasting and dietary practices, but I personally don't recall specific references to this or that plant or root or drug that would be used to bring on the visionary experience. But yeah, it wouldn't surprise me.
Thank you. Salama 510, thank you for the super chat. Could John and Jesus have been Essenes but broke off, or were part of a sect of Essenes that were anti-Herod? There must have been shades to the movement, and weird how silent gospels are on Essenes.
Very good point. Very good question. We've been discussing this in the Zoom meeting, so I hope Salama will join if he hasn't yet, or she. I can't see by the name who it is or the picture.
Right.
Here's the mystery question. If we have the flourishing of the teacher and his movement in the 1st century BCE, and then we go to Jesus, and then we add another 40 years to the destruction of the temple, and then another 70 or so years up to Bar Kokhba, almost 70 years. Wow, we're talking about a long period. And Qumran, we know, goes up to 70, but we can't be sure that the Essenes totally died out with the Roman revolt in 70. We do know the settlement was destroyed, but they might have scattered and continued, just like the Ebionites did, the followers of Jesus that went into Transjordan. But here's what we don't know. It's almost the dark ages of the scrolls. What happened between the death of Herod in 4 BC and 70 in terms of this movement?
Right.
We would put them out at Qumran generally, certainly from maybe around 31 or so, all the way up to 70. There might be some periods just based on the archaeology that Jody Magnus and others have worked out of the different levels. But what's the group doing? If they long past the clock, hitting midnight, the 40-year period, and they said, well, God has prolonged the time. How long can you prolong the time? 40 more years? 80 years? 120 years? Do you just keep prolonging?
Right.
And so the idea of Jesus and John the Baptizer rising up, one Davidic, one priestly, according to our texts, and proclaiming, prepare the way in the wilderness, get baptized for the remission of sins. You're going to be part of a new covenant. It is almost irresistible to see some shade of association with the movement, broadly speaking. I rather like what Robert Eisenman calls it. He calls it the Messianic apocalyptic movement in late Second Temple Judaism, meaning there are all kinds of branches to this, but the earliest reckoning we get is in the scrolls. And then when you go to the New Testament, you get another phase of that same movement. So, was Jesus a card-carrying Essene? Doesn't seem to be in terms of the strict observance of the original group.
Right.
But think of other original groups, say in America, Seventh-day Adventists, Jehovah's Witnesses, Mormons, three indigenous three indigenous groups that started in our own 19th century.
Right.
They're very, very much more strict in the early days than they are today. You know, I mean, I meet Seventh-day Adventists, and some of them eat meat and some don't, and most are vegetarian, but not all. And
right.
You get Mormons that drink coffee and tea, or they like bad Mormons necessarily.
Yep.
You know, people begin to get, they can identify with the religion, but the religion can unfold in various forms, especially in terms of strict observance of the Torah. And it seems like the Jesus movement is more open to interpretations, much like the Pharisees were, but even maybe more so than the Pharisees. But notice Solomon refers to something else. Why aren't they referred to in the New Testament?
Right.
Are they what? The Herodians, the anti-Herodians? You know, are they referred to cryptically? And some have said, well, they're not referred to because they're the movement.
That's
So
yeah.
They're the remnants of the messianic apocalyptic group of late Second Temple Judaism. And Paul then would be part of that, but then he's taking it in entirely new international directions that probably the original indigenous group never thought of, you know, going into all the world and making it universal. As far as we can tell, Jesus and these John the Baptist and so forth, they can be open to Gentiles, but James represents for us pretty much, in the book of Acts at least, Jews need to stay with the Torah. You can't just throw everything off and become this new religion. So
yeah, I think that's a great observation, and it makes me wonder, like, it's easy to look at other groups, and usually they're criticizing or finding people in the groups that are good, like you see Nicodemus and others.
Yeah.
But I find it really interesting. Here's this group that's enough well known that Josephus mentions them and others mention them. But they aren't, it's like the person who's speaking isn't going to speak about their own group because they're the one always talking. And that's what makes it interesting, is like, is that evidence pointing towards this is the group looking at the other groups, and this group is in somewhat in that vein. But thank you so much.
Keep this in mind too, Derek, and everybody. The word Essene is a word that we get from classical Greek writers, such as Josephus, Pliny, and Philo. So that's a Greek way of describing some kind of group that would fit under that rubric. But what does that really mean? And there are different proposals. The one that I've been most attracted to is that it's a corruption of the word osim. And osim in Hebrew, from asa, to do, is the doers. Now, that's what they call themselves. And then you begin to read things like Jesus, be doers of the Torah, not just hearers, right? Or Paul, who also quotes that, and also says, you are children of light, not children of darkness, to his converts. Now, what if it's not a formal name, but more a way of describing, and then it gets picked up as a name, like a label, you see?
Right.
And I think that's what we're dealing with. For example, in the Mishnah, what do you call Sadducees, and particularly in the Talmud? Call them Epicureans, because they don't believe in life after death. Well, obviously, no Sadducee said, I'm an Epicurean. They believe in God. They believe in the revelation of the Torah. They believe in Moses as a prophet and so forth. So the name thing could be tricky. By the way, in the course, I go over that very thoroughly, and we have a whole section on the trickiness of the term Essene. But if it does mean osim, if it comes from osim, then we should probably just talk about the doers. You know, what do you think about the doers? The doers of what? The doers of the Torah, the keepers of the way, the new covenanters. I kind of like to go with how they describe themselves. Well, then I go to the New Testament. I find some of these terms are used in the New Testament.
It makes me think of Nike. Just do it.
Just do it. Yeah.
The Greek goddess of victory. Just do it. Okay. Logan Fisher, thank you, member, for 15 months. You hopefully you'll stay around for 40 years, and then the end will come. And I really appreciate.
Well, what if God prolongs the time beyond all that the prophets have written? Did you catch that in the quote? You can't use, if you're going to use Daniel 9 anymore, sorry, 70 weeks people. According to the scrolls, that was over.
Right.
And now he's prolonged the time more than any of the prophets even knew, because the mysteries of God are inexhaustible. This is the ultimate way to deal with prophecy failing. Just say, like, hey, it wasn't wrong, it was extended.
Right.
So, but it didn't fail, it's still coming. I covered that in the series on prophecy a lot.
Well, that's how every
group, know where you find that in the New Testament? 2 Peter.
Right.
Everybody's saying, since the fathers fell asleep, where's the promise of his coming? All things continue as they were from the beginning of the creation. The world's not transformed. And we thought it, and he goes, oh, my children, don't you know that a day with the Lord is 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is a day? So the Lord's not slack. He's not negligible with his promises. Those promises are true, but you're looking at the wrong clock. You got to have God's clock to know the answer. So even though the teacher was given the revelation, I think he must have taught this. The end's going to come 40 years after me, because he's calculating those, remember the Jubilees?
Mm-hmm.
And they think they're in the first week of the 10th Jubilee. Well, see, that's getting into the first 7 years of a 49-year period. So it's got to come. And notice they say about 40 years. They don't have it exactly down.
Yeah.
Well, what are you going to do when that doesn't come? It's easy. Just prolong the days.
It happens every time. Yep. Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for that. Sense of Soul. And James, I got to use the restroom real quick, but was the authors from the Essene sect that wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls? Hold on. Was the authors from the Essene sect that wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls? Also, I've been told that Mother Mary and her family were Essene. Thank you both. Great live. Sorry if a bit off topic.
Okay, you're going to miss the answer, but you can hear it later, Derek. Thanks a lot for your question. Well, again, it's kind of tricky because are we going to call the people who wrote the scroll Essenes, taking a name from Greek writers? I do think there's enough similarity in Josephus's description of the group he calls the Essenes that we can match them with the group at Qumran, and most scholars would be willing to call them Essenes. I would call them Essenes in like double scare quotes, meaning depending on what you mean by Essene. When my students ask me, was Jesus an Essene? I always want to say, tell me where you get your definition of an Essene. And the answer almost has to be Josephus, Pliny, Philo. We get some descriptions of a group referred to as the Essenes and a few other classical writers. Well, was he that? Or are these writers that are reflecting what they generally feel is true of this group? Whereas in the scrolls, we have their own writing. So the difference between somebody writing about them who's not really part of them and the group itself writing what they've been told. As far as Mary, the mother of Jesus, the only text that might hint at that is a late text, 2nd century. It's got the weirdest name, the Proangelium of James, the brother of Jesus. The Proangelium, meaning it's the before gospel of James, claims to be written by James, and it starts with the story of Joachim and Anna, the parents of Mary. And it does say that Joachim goes off into the desert or the wilderness or retreats to get near God. And some people have read that and said, oh, he's probably an Essene. And maybe he went down toward the Dead Sea somewhere and is meditating. And then when he comes back, Anna is pregnant. And I might point out, because I'm just publishing a book called The Lost Mary, How the Jewish Mother of Jesus Became the Virgin Mother of God. It's out in French. Unfortunately, the English won't be out till next spring. So you're going to have to wait a year for that. It's getting delayed by the publisher for various reasons in terms of other books during the election year that they've already lined up because of all the craziness in our country. But I'm willing to wait. But if you read French or you want to slowly translate it, you can get the French. But what I do say in that book is notice, please, that when Joachim comes back, his wife, Anna, Mary's mother, says, guess what? I'm pregnant. But he's been gone. Isn't that interesting? Take a look. She said, I'm pregnant. Either he's got some sort of long-lasting ability to impregnate a woman, like before he left, because you get the idea that he's gone for a while. So I don't know. But it's hard from that to connect her from that, 2nd century text. People usually date it like 180 or something like that. It's hard to date. It's a crazy text, by the way. I love reading it. It's very entertaining. They check on whether Mary's a virgin after Jesus is born.
Oh, yeah.
And the midwife inserts her hand into her. Need I explain? And her hand just burns up. And she goes, whoa, wow. I guess we don't need to do this. So it's fun to read, but not making fun of it. And Mary's a little Vestal virgin in the temple until she starts her period. And then we have a problem at age 12. So crazy text.
Thank you so much, Sense of Soul. Paul.
Guess what? They're from Cephras, we think. How about that? So anyway.
Thank you. Paulogia in the house.
Yay,
if you haven't subscribed, where have you been?
Yeah.
Much love to Derek and James. Thank you, Paul. Appreciate the love and support, my friend. And I love what you're doing lately. Keep up the good work. You should have James back on again soon. There's so much to talk about, James.
Yeah, he did a couple really good promos for the Dead Sea Scroll course. So he can run those again if he wants. Yeah.
You make a great cartoon, I must admit. Great cartoon. Salama's back again. Jesus, how much of a resistor or appeaser to Rome? Gospels have him more on the appease side and Torah liberal. John Dominic Crossan has him as a resistor, but in peace.
Yeah, well, it's just hard to know. I certainly don't think he's an appeaser in the sense, it depends on what you mean by appease. He apparently, from our evidence, and here it's, you go from Brandon to Crossan, Brandon wrote Jesus the Zealot long before, what was his name? Aslan.
Yeah, Reza Aslan.
Reza. And both books are worth reading, but I'm thinking that Jesus, from all of our records, is teaching turn the other cheek and, don't, if you live by the sword, you'll die by the sword and all these kinds of things. Mm-hmm. Now, some of those are tropes that you find in other literature, but they're being put into his mouth, whether he spoke them or not. And he does seem to, he's unlike other messiahs of the period. And we got about a dozen, over about 100-year period, according to Josephus. And most all of them break into an armory, begin to arm people in the desert, and then they march on some city, whether it's Jerusalem or Cephras, or cross the Jordan River like Moses, or try to. That's right. My favorite. The guy who says, open the river, and then it doesn't open, so that was over. And then the Romans come and kill him, and Simon of Perea and so forth. Yeah. So he does stand out in our text, at least, as being different. But I do really like Crossan's idea that he wants to dismantle Rome by a kind of seductive social agenda of dismantling all the categories important to Rome for its social and economic and political well-being. And also probably so many of the categories of Judaism. And so Dom makes a good case, I think, for this. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem to work very well unless you do believe that Constantinian Christianity represents a great moral triumph for the world, and Christianity has brought all of these blessings, even with the tattered history that it has of heretics and martyrs and killing and so forth.
Right.
But if you just take the Gospels and some of the core teachings, Paul especially as well, because we have his early letters, don't resist evil. If your enemy hungers, feed him, and so forth. There does seem to be that pacifist element. But I always wonder, how pacifist is it?
Right.
Because Crossan doesn't think of Jesus as this radical apocalyptic guy, but rather the guy that puts the leaven in the bread, and it's going to slowly spread over hundreds of years and finally overthrow Rome. I love his book on all of this. What's the name of the book with the coin on the front? You interviewed.
Yeah, Render unto Caesar.
Yeah, exactly. I love the ideas, but I can't help going with Schweitzer and thinking that Jesus felt very soon the whole house is going to be brought down, not by passive resistance, but by people holding on and among themselves living the way of peace, where there's no Jew or Gentile, bond or free, slave, rich or poor, Jew or Gentile, bond or free, economic, social, ethnic divisions are melted together. But as a way of bringing on the end, and that's what we find in Paul's letter, say 1 Corinthians 7. In view of the present distress, don't change your status. Like if you're circumcised, stay. If you're not, because it's all going to change. The form of this world is passing away. That, I think, is more likely. So what did Jesus expect? We have no way of knowing. But if he did willingly go to the cross rather than kicking and screaming, if he saw it as part of his duty to give himself up to the evil forces as he understood them, the Roman forces, did he expect, even before his death or shortly after his death, to have some sort of heavenly vindication? Because in our earliest pericopes that are in the two sources, the Q material and so forth, you do get the idea that there's going to be this apocalyptic vindication when the Son of Man comes in the clouds of heaven and so forth. So, and you find it also all through the synoptics.
Right.
So I would tend to think that he's very against many things in Greco-Roman culture, but he's not trying to actively resist it with military force or raising an army or getting weapons together. So,
yeah. Oh gosh, you and me should do a stream sometime where we have the time to cover this in more depth, because I'm on the same page with you, and it can go on and on. And we have quite a few super chats I want to try and get out of the way before we let you go, because I know you have things to do today. JC asks, and I cannot read Hebrew, derived from this plus this as Sumerian? I know you probably don't know Sumerian, but specifically, I don't know if you know this.
It looks like it's Bardso from Paras El, Sumerian. I don't know. I just don't know. El is, of course, God, but these kind of etymological derivations are always difficult. And I don't read Sumerian either. So JC's ahead of me here.
Yeah, I don't know.
Bar is son of, Sel. Paras. Parats is to break open. So
I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know the answer, JC. Email me and tell me about it.
Thanks, JC. Stop skimming, man. When it comes to the Dead Sea Scrolls versions of Leviticus, are there any textual variants contrary to the current Masoretic text, which gives insight into the context of the discourse on ritual?
I haven't really worked much on the variants in Leviticus, but I'll tell you what I'll do here. And you probably can do this. Leviticus has never particularly drawn me, I guess you could say. But
you're not attracted to the endless this and that, curse and bless? Come on.
Let's see. Okay, I'm just looking. As I this is the Dead Sea Scroll Bible, which anybody can get, and it's in English. It was done by Wise. No, it was done by Abegg, Flint, and Ulrich. I was thinking of the translation. And what it does at the bottom of each page is it puts the variants. So this is going to be a quick and dirty look here, but it looks to me like it's mainly really small changes, like burn offering for offering by fire, burn it rather than maybe something else. I'm just trying to see. Pour out blood for splashing blood. So it sounds very, very ritualistic. Unless you mean the discourse on ritual, do you mean the holiness code maybe? I wonder if he means that. That's 18 and 19. I don't see too many differences there. Depends on what he means by the discourse on ritual. I wouldn't call that ritual. The holiness code is that list of things like rise up before the aged, don't trip the blind, like use just weights. It's what people would tend to think of as more moral. But as it goes on, it also has a lot of sexual material. Like right. who can you have sexual relations with or marry? And so forth. Also forbidding the occult. I don't see anything, but I'm not equipped to really answer that off the top of my head. But I guarantee you can find it in the literature easily. If you go to particularly JSTOR as one of the sources, or just even Google will get you some things.
Thank you. Amana Sun Bay, thank you for the super chat. I really appreciate it. Stop Scamming Man again says, are there any noteworthy differences between the book of Enoch as it now is and within the Dead Sea Scrolls? By the way, I went from thinking the writer of Revelation was crazy to thinking he read this book.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, the Dead Sea Scroll examples of Enoch are pretty limited. Today we have all these 5 books of Enoch that we divided, and then
right.
We have 2nd Enoch and 3rd Enoch, which are called Enoch just because they're much, much later. But what we have from the Dead Sea Scrolls, there are rumors, by the way, of a more complete copy that disappeared. So that's been intriguing some of us for years and years and years. And it goes back to some things that certain editors said about the scrolls early on. I'm not going to name them. It's pretty controversial. But that, like, somebody might have sold one of those things, and that was years ago. You'd think it would have surfaced by now.
Yeah.
But I really haven't made a study of the differences, but it really changes things in terms of the book of Enoch, because we finally would have a more Semitic version of it rather than just Ethiopic. Think about it. The Enoch that we all read and that we get in the pseudepigrapha volumes of Charlesworth and R.H. Charles and so forth, that's based on the Ethiopic. However, if you look at Charlesworth's volume for the Enoch material, he's going to include discussions on variant readings. So I would recommend that. James Charlesworth. And he's the editor. He didn't write that particular section. Awesome. But as far as the writer reading the book, R.H. Charles has an interesting chart. That's that big book. I think it's 1912, Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha of the Old Testament. You probably want to get it in a library. I own it because I just love it. But he has a chart in the back with all the parallels between any New Testament text and First Enoch. And many of them are from the book of Revelation. And a lot of times they're just phrases, certain sentences, sometimes just ideas. But it is pretty impressive. And then everybody knows, I think, maybe not everybody, but the book of Jude, which is the letter of Jude, the brother of Jesus, supposedly, who's the brother of James, who's the brother of Jesus. It starts by saying, quoting 1 Enoch chapter 1, the Lord comes with 10,000 of his saints. And quotes it as scripture. So that's got to tell you that when we think of our canon, or even the Hebrew Bible canon, we've got to realize that these groups are using a variety of texts in the late Second Temple period. And many have suggested that the Qumran material, broadly speaking, represents a kind of library of texts, and then we break it down by our categories. Like we go, oh, well, there's Holy Scripture, and then there's pseudepigraphal texts like Jubilees or the Testament of 12 Patriarchs, right? And then there are other texts that they wrote. We call them sectarian texts. We're imposing, I mean, I think those categories could be useful for shuffling out the differences.
Right.
But are we sure that that's the way they thought of those texts? Now, the argument would be that when they're doing commentaries on the text, like the Habakkuk Pesher, the Nahum Pesher, they're quoting the Hebrew Bible version. And when they're passing on these other texts, they're giving versions of those texts. But it's a really slippery slope. And, you just have to go to somebody that works more on the scrolls as they compare to the Hebrew Bible, which I'm not an expert in.
Thank you.
Some of your buddies are, though.
Oh gosh, the problem with it, James, is we don't have time to talk about it all without being here all day, and I just think it's only respectful to you to have your answers, and then we can always do another stream. So we will
I can confess my ignorance on certain questions here, so I hope that'll get respected.
No worries. Michael Apple, thank you for the super chat. Great content as usual. I might have missed it, but do we have a plausible date for the teacher of righteousness? I've seen dating from almost 200 BCE to within a generation of Jesus. Thanks.
Yeah, that was covered at the first, Michael. You can listen to the first again. That was the first point of the 5, the dating. I would say very definitely around 175 on down to the Herodian period. So that's the flourishing of the movement. And part of the argument is that all references to contemporary events just drop off. Like we've got Alexander the Great, doesn't mean the scrolls were written there. We got Nebuchadnezzar mentioned. We got Antiochus Epiphanes. But then when they follow it on down and begin talking about the time of the end, they're basically playing around with Daniel 11. Well, that's way on down into the Maccabean period, past Antiochus Epiphanes. So I would recommend Michael Wise, W-I-S-C, and his articles that you can get, they're published in journals and so forth. One of them is in the Journal of Biblical Literature, and it's called Dating the Flourishing of the Teacher and His Movement. And I find it quite impressive. And it was impressive enough that the mainstream scholars that had been leaning towards 2nd century BCE included it in this Oxford Handbook of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Not that article, but Wise's take on it. I take that as like some of the major scholars that you've interviewed, Derek, like John Collins and others like James Vanderkam, who had something to say about that handbook and what it would be. They, as far as the dating of the teacher, they use Michael's stuff. I've read the article. We cover it in the course and talk about it, and you get actually a copy of it as part of the course. So if you sign up for the course, you don't have to look for it. Another reason to sign up for the course, you get all these free PDFs of all kinds of things. One of my favorites is Martin Abegg, Are We Still Seeing Double? The Messiah at Qumran. I love the title. 2 messiahs, 1 messiah. 2 messiahs, right. 1 messiah. It's like you're at the up. What do you see there?
Right.
And it's a great article. It's part of the course. Because did you notice that quote? Until the coming of the teacher or the prophet like Moses and the messiahs of Aaron and Israel. And that's what we find in the Testament of the 12 Patriarchs. The Messiah of Levi and the Messiah of Judah. and whether those are Christian interpolations of the Testaments or whether they are an idea of two messiahs, which I've leaned towards, one priestly, one more Davidic, who's called the prince of the congregation. And in one of the rules, it's called the Messianic rule. It's part of Cave 1. You have a banquet in which you seem to have the priest blessing the bread and the wine, and then the Messiah reaching for his portion, like you got two of them together. You also find that in Zechariah chapter 6. You've got the king, the branch of David, sitting on the throne. By his side will be a priest who is his counselor. And when I think of that pattern, I think of John the Baptist and Jesus. And by the way, I think John was greater than Jesus, according to Jesus. I'm quoting the man here. Among those born of women, there's none greater than John. I realize there's a gloss that's been added by some pious Christian, but nevertheless, anyone in the kingdom is greater than John. Okay, fine. Even leave that. But among those born of women, there's none greater than John. And is he a prophet? I tell you, more than a prophet. So is Jesus saying that John is the Elijah or the prophet like Moses? Remember in the Transfiguration, Moses, Elijah, Jesus.
Exactly.
There's the tripart division, you see. So
thank you so much. Yeah, this is fun. Topic discussed. Thank you, Gary, for the super chat. I had to step away. Did you talk about how many people are usually in a Zoom call with Dr. Tabor? Usually. I would love the opportunity to ask plenty of questions, but they could be difficult with hundreds of people in Zoom.
Yeah, we usually get more than 50, but not more than 100 or so. So it is hard for everybody to ask questions. So what I do is I have people, if you're in the course, you email me your questions. A lot of people ask the same question. And then I assemble them together in a document and often correlate them. And then we try to take them by topics rather than who asked them. But towards the end, we usually allow an open time. It's a little hard because some people, as you know, in any talk show or anything, remember Larry King? What's your question? What's your question? You have somebody that wants to make statements rather than ask questions.
Right.
Now, a few times Derek's been in there with me, and boy, he rides it. You know, he's got his whip on the stallion. And he basically, in a nice way, says, well, that's a great thought, but do you have a question? So it is live, but it's not as live as it could be. But we might find ways to, as we go along in the course, we might decide, I want to do some topics right now. We're doing like big topics. You know, what was the career of the teacher? What was their eschatology and all these things, and suffering servant. But we can have, we usually do, what did we do with Mark, Derek? I think we did 7 months.
You did a lot.
Yeah, so we could end up going a few more months with this until we have another course out. And then we'll switch to that course. But I could see having a couple sessions where people get to ask questions and we have them freely ask, but we do limit the time.
Right.
You know, in other words, write your question out and have it well formulated, like the people are doing here, and just read it. And then at least you get the live. And that way I can look at people and go back and forth, and there'll be a little more of a dynamic. Now, Derek and I have dreamed of another idea, and I don't know if we'll ever do it. If he keeps moving around the country, it's going to be hard to do. But Charlotte's pretty central, and you used to live in North Carolina. So are you going to Florida? Is that like a
pretty certain.
So you're going to Florida. We got East Coast, West Coast, North, South, all around the world. But let's say we set something up where people come from our weekend, and I book a local hotel in Charlotte. And you'd have to pay your transportation in your hotel room. And we could have 100 people, maybe 200. I don't know, like a conference.
Right.
And basically it would be hanging out together and talking. Wouldn't that be nice? Maybe we could have sessions, like a morning session on mythicism or something, and an afternoon session on the Gospels. And then we could fly in Robin and others maybe to be there and just kind of have 4 or 5 scholars together hanging out for a weekend. We'd have to, charge a little bit to pay for the speakers' transportation, but a lot of scholars would be glad to do that. They can bring their books and have them signed. And so think about that. If you guys like that, Derek has to be the guy to do it. But Charlotte could be a good place.
It can be done.
Wouldn't that be amazing?
That would.
A MythVision conference.
That'd be awesome.
And pick 4 or 5 really great topics and have some of your all-time chosen scholars, whoever you wanted to choose, that you felt would represent the different areas. And then we would get to meet each other too and hang out.
Absolutely.
And what you could do at a conference like that is the after hours stuff.
That's the best. Hanging out
and people are talking to each other and talking to us. And
usually they'll have a few drinks at the bar. Sometimes the hotels have a bar in there, so you can really relax, and just be yourself and not worry. But yeah, let's make something happen. This is something we definitely need to make happen. Couple more here, James, before I let you go. Inquisitive Mind says MythVision is the vaccine in this crazy world.
That's pretty nice.
Thank you, Ghost of MythVision. You know who you are. Maynard saves. Where does scholarship think Jesus was most his life?
Scholarship probably doesn't agree on that or anything else, but we got Egypt. We've got India. Hey, let's put him in Athens studying with the philosophers. I don't know. It's always like he must have picked up stuff. It's usually Egypt. It's usually the Eastern mysteries are Egypt. I would say Cephas, that he's growing up in the building trades. And if you want, I put up a little video on my channel. It's actually just me reading from my book, The Jesus Dynasty. And it was like the lost years of Jesus revealed at last. Derek taught me how to come up with those clickbait titles. And everybody's like, oh God, now he's going to, I basically say he just got up at every morning at 4:30. He's the oldest son. Once Joseph dies and the boys head in, and Mary packs their lunch and they walk the hour and a half to Cephas, as I've done many times, and they work all day and come home at night, tired as hell, and they go to bed by dark. And that's what he did.
Right.
And he hung out at the synagogue and talked to rabbis and went down to Jerusalem for the feast. So I don't put him anywhere. But I like that idea because in our earliest gospel, Mark, the one text we have that kind of rings true to me is Mark 6, verse 3, because it calls him Jesus, the son of Mary. Is this not the tecton? Isn't it that builder? They didn't call him. Isn't that the mystical traveler who just returned from India? Or the guy who went down to Egypt and learned the mysteries of the Isis religion or something?
Right.
I get the idea that he's immersing himself into Jewish lore. Now, he could have well gone to Qumran. If I had him go anywhere outside of the northern Galilee, or the lower Galilee, the north, meaning of Galilee, I could have him go down in the desert and hang out with those guys to talk about, hey, did you know that teacher? Or well, my grandfather knew him. And I remember when I was 3 years old, they talked about him. What did he look like? God, don't you wish you could know stuff like this? But that if I was writing a novel, I would have him go down to the desert and, talk to people. Now, Josephus says he did that. He's a first century guy, fairly contemporary with Jesus. And doesn't he say he went into the desert for 3 years?
That Josephus did. Yeah.
Yeah. And also Paul.
Josephus said that he went.
Paul says,
and Paul
Josephus says that he, not Jesus, went and studied with a desert teacher called Banus. And Paul says that when he got his big revelation of Jesus appearing to him or whatever, I don't mean Acts, I mean Galatians. He said, I went into Arabia and then after 3 years returned. Depending on how you do the 3 years, he might have only gone for a week. But the next thing is, and 3 years later, I did this. And some people think, I tend to lean toward the idea that Arabia is the Arava, meaning the desert. So Apostle Paul might have gone down there too.
And there's a lot of desert down there, trust me. So that's a lot.
You're pixelating. Is that me? Is that my internet?
It's probably me. My internet probably sucks right now. I don't know why, but it probably does. Sun Bay, is the Dead Sea Scrolls see Hellenism ideas heretical according to the religion? Are early Christians and hybrid of culture influences?
Yeah, the trick there is Hellenism. I'm going to recommend an Encyclopedia Britannica article that you can get online by my teacher, Jonathan Z. Smith. It's called Hellenistic Religion. It's only a few pages. It's the most brilliant thing, I think, ever written on Hellenism. And his argument, and many of us share this, is that all religions are Hellenized thoroughly in this period. Now, I'm not talking about whether you have a statue of a naked goddess on your mantle or whether you're praying votive offerings to the dead or something like that. But there's a matrix of ideas that everybody's beginning to share. It's the opposite of Sadducean Judaism. It has to do particularly with, is this world a good place where we belong? Or is it a bad place where we've fallen? Is it a place of light or of darkness? And are our souls, when we die, have the ability to either go to Hades and then ascend and be reincarnated or finally rise up? It sounds like even in the Dead Sea Scrolls, I think Smith would say all forms of Judaism are Hellenized, except for, if we could find it, a strict Sadducean Judaism. Now, there are two documents in the Apocrypha that anybody can get online, or if you have a Catholic Bible or a study Bible. And that is Wisdom of Solomon and Jesus ben Sirach. So one's called Wisdom, the other's called Sirach. Read both of those, because in Wisdom of Solomon, you have a Judaism that's Hellenized in the way that I think Jesus and everybody is of that time, beginning to believe in the world to come and eternal life and final judgments. These are all Hellenistic things. And then read Jesus ben Sirach. The guy's name was Jesus, by the way, ben Sirach. And he's saying, no, there's justice in this world. This is a good world. It's gone bad by human behavior, but God created a good world. And what's wrong with it? It's kind of the Job argument. Remember, Job keeps saying, no, there's got to be something more because I was unjustly treated. His friends are, no, God is just. Well, Sirach is arguing, no, everything's going to get repaid. So it really, you could just call it afterlife. It really comes down to afterlife. You understand, once you go into afterlife, for the hoi polloi, for everybody, you're in the Hellenistic world. You say, well, why would that be the great Greek idea? Because it's essentially implying that this world is not my home. And the earliest text I know of is probably Pythagorean, and maybe from Empedocles kinds of followers. It's those golden plates. I have a YouTube video on it. And what the text says, it's prayers in the world of Hades, where you tell the guardians of Hades, I'm a child of earth and starry heaven, but heaven alone is my home. You yourselves know this. Give me to drink of the water of remembrance. So you're down in the lower world, and your soul doesn't get trapped. It gets to come up and ascend to heaven. So, you read the Gospels, Jesus is talking, I saw Satan fall as lightning. He believes in demons, talks about the age to come, resurrection of the dead. Smith would argue that these are all Hellenistic ideas. So according to the question, they would see certain things practice-wise as Hellenistic, for sure. Like, I do not think the teacher has a, statue of Zeus, in his little room there. Says, oh, that's just a cultural, beautiful thing I like to have. And other kinds of practices of the Gentiles. But in terms of their ideas, they bought into this whole children of light, children of darkness, this kind of dualism, we call it, of the ancient world. And it's pretty ubiquitous. I'm trying to think if there's any religion that stuck with the old view, which is the ancient Near Eastern view. So Smith calls the new view utopian. You see why? It's this perfect world in the future. And he calls the ancient view, Gilgamesh, the locative. You worked on this, Derek. The locative means you're locative. You're in place. You're a mortal human on the earth. Make the best of it. And if you don't like the way it is, fix it. And the utopian is, oh no, this world is just a shadow of the world to come. Plato, and so forth, you see. And so that's my understanding of the term Hellenism. So I'm separating it from, like, what kind of food customs do you have, or what kind of artwork do you have on your floors, or something like that. They definitely would be conservative, these guys. Remember, these guys think the end is coming in 40 years. So they're going to be strict.
Thank you. Yaden Zedek, thank you for the super chat, my friend. Always seeing you here. What up, D? What up, Doc? Sorry I'm late. Hey, Doc, I'm going to your course. Everyone sign up for Dr. Tabor's course. Thank you.
Did you pay him $10 to say that? I'm just kidding.
No.
I really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Yadin, I appreciate it. And I hope to see you in the Zoom meeting on Sunday, the 28th. I think I'm going to ask, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll ask everyone who's signed up in the last, what should we say, since January 1st, Derek, to just raise their hand, where we can welcome the new students.
Yeah.
Because our last meeting was December, so that'll be a cool New Year's. So if you sign up, I'll let you raise your hand and recognize you somehow as joining the Yaka, the group.
Welcome to the family. And then JC's back just to kind of give some clarity to the earlier question, I guess, was Sumerian Anbar equals Akkadian Arzu, Hebrew Barzel.
I just don't know, but I've got this. I'll have this recording. I'm going to look into that. Thank you, JC, for that clarification.
Yeah, thank you so much. Any final words from you, Dr. Tabor, as we go off into our weekend? For me, into this winter wonderland of snow and snuggles, I'll call it, because we're going to get warm and probably cuddle up.
It's 40 degrees here, Derek. So what is it there, Fahrenheit?
Right now, I think it's 20 something. So it's pretty cold. So
you guys are used to it. We think it's like the end of the world if it's even 20 down here. So in the South. So no, I think we kind of covered it. Sorry about some of the questions. I just really don't feel I can give a up-to-date answer on, but it's always fun doing things with you, Derek. And I love the variation of your audience and the diversity and everything. So hope to see some people in the course. And we're going to meet again next Friday, and we're going to talk about is it Friday again we're meeting? No, Thursday. I think we're meeting next Thursday. Right? Yeah, you've got it up. I said Friday, but it's next Thursday.
Yeah,
2 o'clock Eastern.
Yep.
I can change it. And
I put it to 11 a.m. Pacific, which is 2 o'clock your time. Remember how earlier I said running behind, so I pushed in an hour. I accidentally pushed the other one to 12, but it's actually going to be 11 as well. We can always bump it if you want.
Fix that if you can. So next week we want to pick this up again. And now we've got a few of the points of the teacher. We want to talk about let's say he died or was killed. Obviously he died, but was he killed? What about this suffering? And did he see himself in the role of a suffering servant? And remember, excuse me, in the suffering servant hymns, particularly 53, the servant gets highly exalted. So
I apologize. It's Yadin.
I'm losing my voice here. So.
It's pronounced Yadin. Thank you so much for super chat. You didn't have to do that, brother, to help me out in pronouncing your name properly. I apologize. Thank you so much, Dr. Tabor. Everybody in the comment section, I pinned the course link. It's in the description if you're watching this later. And I asked a poll question. There was no wrong answer. It was, did you like the video? Yes. Did you like the video? And the second poll says, yes. And we had 269 votes say yes. So it's a shocking conclusion to find out the answer of that poll. Yeah. But thank you. Let's have a wonderful weekend, and I'll be seeing you soon. And never forget.
Safe, take care.
We are MythVision.